If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you are going to start your own podcast, or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you're going to need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. And if you ever want to read a book I have mentioned on this podcast, I now have an affiliated link for Bookshop. All the affiliated links that I mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. This is just a reminder that this podcast has merch and a Patreon, and if you could contribute to one of those to help keep this podcast going, I would greatly appreciate it. I wanted to give a quick content warning in this episode. Violence and sexual assault are mentioned. I will leave a timestamp in the episode description when I get to the sexual assault part. But I do not go into graphic detail about it. I mention it and then I move on. As for the violence comes up occasionally in this story, but I do not go into graphic detail on that either. But if you need to skip this episode, I understand. Alright, now let's get into the episode. The story that I am about to tell you, which will take multiple episodes to tell, is a story full of murders, executions, ambition, plots to overthrow a government, multiple lovers, and a shit ton of men named James. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 5th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. We are in season 4 of History Shelf, and it is titled They Are a Rainbow. This season of History Shelf, I will be covering each week a historical figure that was a part of the LGBTQIA community. These were people that during their time they had to hide a part of their identity from the world. So while I fully believe that those who were out and proud in their lifetime, even if it had the potential to cost them everything, deserve to be praised and recognized, those are not the people that I will be covering this season. I am covering the ones that were made to love in the shadows, the ones that had to lie to most or all of the people around them. Now, I know that sexual orientation and gender identity are complex, and some of the terms that I will use to describe these subjects were not around in some of their lifetimes. So, some of these subjects obviously would not have used the same words to describe themselves as I will be using, but I don't want to get too hung up on my wording. I just want to celebrate a part of these individuals that, in their time, there was pressure all around them to feel shame about. I want to focus on that love and gender are not black and white. They are a rainbow. And for this week, I am talking about King James VI and First. Today, I am covering somebody that has made multiple guest appearances on this podcast. I know of at least 4. There could be more, but I know for sure of 4. But they themselves have never been the subject of an episode of History Shelf. Until now. King James VI and First was born James Charles Stewart. And if you're wondering how someone could have been the 6th and the 1st, I will explain that a little later on. James was the son of Henry Stewart, Lord Darnley, and Mary Queen of Scots. James has a family connection to some of the people that I talked about in season 1 of History Shelf. His great-great-grandfather was King Henry VII. He was his great-great-grandson through both of his parents. King Henry VII was the father of King Henry VIII, and James's great-grandmother was Margaret Tudor. Margaret was the sister of King Henry VIII that survived childhood that I have not done an episode of History Shelf on. James was born on June 19th, 1566 in Edinburgh Castle, Scotland. Despite being the son of a queen, James had a pretty rough start in his life. His father died on February 10th, 1567 at the age of 20. James was only 8 years old at the time, so James never got to really know his father. His father, Lord Darnley, was murdered. Lord Darnley was staying at a house called Kirkhofield. Around 2 a.m., there were 2 explosions that rocked the foundation of Kirkhofield. What had happened was someone's placed 2 barrels of gunpowder under the small room beneath Lord Darnley's room, but the explosion didn't kill him. He was found murdered, though, outside. He was surrounded by a cloak, a dagger, a chair, and a coat. It was ruled that someone had smothered him to death. A post-mortem found that he had internal injuries, but that was believed to have been caused by the explosion. Now, John Knox insisted that he had been strangled, but John Knox didn't know. I don't know if you remember John Knox. He was a religious zealot. I mentioned him in the Queen Elizabeth I episode of History Shelf. He hated women and he hated Catholics, so you can imagine how he felt about Mary, Queen of Scots, the Catholic Queen of Scotland. So, if Lord Darnley was murdered, then who was the one that murdered him? Well, officially, this murder is unsolved, but most believe that it was James Hepburn, 4th Earl of Bothwell. He was a nobleman that became Mary, Queen of Scots' 3rd husband after Lord Darnley died. It is possible that Mary may have been involved in the murder as well. She was the one that told Lord Darnley to go to Kirkhofield, and she did get married to Bothwell very soon after Lord Darnley's death, though she did say that Bothwell kidnapped, raped, and married her. But she definitely had reason for wanting Darnley dead. Many advised Mary not to marry Darnley, but she didn't listen, and she came to regret that. And that was because Darnley was a fuckboy. He was annoying, shallow, vain, weak, lazy, selfish, arrogant, vindictive, and spoiled. Before his death, Darnley had also been involved in the murder of Mary's best friend, David Rizzio. There was a rumor that was going around that David was Mary's lover, and he was the one that had impregnated her. And so when Mary was 6 months pregnant, Darnley and some other men burst into Mary's bedchamber where her and David were hanging out, though they weren't doing any sexy lover stuff. They were just hanging out as friends. No one now believes that Mary and David were anything more than just friends. So, anyways, they burst into her room and they ended up stabbing David 57 times. So, if you watched the TV show Reign, that was actually one of the few things that they got right. It's unclear if Darnley did any of the stabbing in the murder or if he just stood there. I can kind of see it being the latter, but either way, he did have a hand in David's death. Mary at least pretended to forgive Darnley, but I could totally understand if her forgiveness was all just an act. So there is a reason to believe that Mary was involved in Darnley's death. There were a lot of people during Mary's time that believed that Mary was guilty. There were a lot of Protestants at the time that were saying that she was, but I can guarantee you that had Mary been a Protestant, not many, if any, would have been saying that. Scotland had been a Catholic country, but by this time, Protestantism had basically taken over Scotland. So, what was known as the Confederate Lords raised an army against Mary and Bothwell. Bothwell was able to safely leave. Don't worry, Bothwell gets his in the end. He ends up dying in a prison in Denmark, but not before he went insane, because in said prison he spent the last 10 years being constantly chained to a pillar. Mary was taken to Edinburgh, where she was forced to advocate in favor of her son, baby James, on July 24th, 1567. At this point, James had just turned 1 the previous month before. So, because James was just a baby, he obviously needed a regent. Mary appointed her illegitimate half-brother, James Stewart, Earl of Moray, as the regent. So, Mary was no longer queen, and she was imprisoned in Lochleven Castle, and her son was the king, but really her half-brother had the power. At this point, people in Scotland were used to babies being the monarch because James was the third one in a row. Mary had become queen when she was just 6 days old, and her father became king when he was 17 months old after his father, King James IV, died. You may remember that I covered the death of King James IV on the very first episode of this podcast. It was the episode I did on Catherine of Aragon. James VI was given to John Erskine, Earl of Mar, and his wife, Annabel Moray, Countess of Mar, to be cared for by them at Stirling Castle. On July 29, 1567, James was anointed King of Scotland at the Church of the Holy Rood. He was anointed by Adam Bothwell, Bishop of Orkney. The sermon was preached by John Knox. So, even though Mary and Darnley were both Catholic, a Protestant preached the sermon. And that was because he was now being brought up by Protestants. Most of the ruling class in Scotland was Protestant. So now James was a member of the Protestant Church of Scotland, known as the Kirk. And it is important that John Knox was the Protestant that they got to preach the sermon, because John Knox had always hated Mary, Queen of Scots. He always called her a whore, even though there wasn't any evidence that she was sleeping around. He believed that Mary had involvement in Darnley's death, and he was not shy about his opinions on Mary. And that was the environment that James was growing up in. He was surrounded by people that hated his mother, people that called his mother an adulteress and a murderer. And though Mary continued on loving him, once she was captured, she never saw her son again. George Buchanan, Peter Young, Adam Erskine, and David Erskine were James's tutors. George was really cruel to James. He would often beat him, and he wanted to make sure that James became a God-fearing Protestant. But despite James's horrible treatment that he received, James had a love of learning. Mary escaped Lochleven and she fled to England. There were many meaning Catholics that thought that Mary was the rightful heir to the throne of England because they saw Elizabeth as illegitimate. So Elizabeth saw Mary fleeing to England as a threat. On January 20th, 1570, James Stewart, the regent, was assassinated by James Hamilton of Bothwell. So then James's paternal grandfather, Matthew Stewart, 4th Earl of Lennox, became James's regent. Matthew was not the regent for long, though. On September 4th, 1571, Matthew was shot to death by supporters of Mary, Queen of Scots. The third regent was John Erskine, Earl of Mar. He was the one that was caring for James. On October 28th or 29th, 1572, John died of some kind of illness. It is mostly believed that he died of natural causes, but it's a possibility that he was poisoned by James Douglas, 4th Earl of Morton. I'm really sorry that there are so many Jameses in this story, and I wish I could tell you that this was the last James, but there's more. Morton got John's office, and he became James's last regent. When I came to this part of my research, it said that Morton was James's most effective regent, but I don't really think that it's all that fair to say that, because Morton was the regent for the longest. He was the regent for 7 years, and the other 3 each didn't even get 2 years. So, of course, he's going to be more effective. He had a significant more amount of time than the other ones had. That's like saying that Franklin D. Roosevelt did more things as the U.S. president than William Henry Harrison. Of course, someone that was the president for 12 years is going to do more than someone that was the president for only 31 days. Or that's like saying that Lady Jane Grey wasn't as good as a queen as Queen Elizabeth I. And yes, I know Lady Jane Grey was never crowned queen, but I'm trying to make a point that I don't think that you can compare how Morton was to the other regents. Morton lost favor when Esmé Stewart came to Scotland from France. Now, this is the first time that I've encountered a man named Esmé, so I don't know if this is the first time for you, but I just wanted to point out that this is a man named Esmé. He was Darnley's first cousin, and I will get back to him in a moment, but first we need to wrap things up with Morton. So, Morton made some enemies. Many thought that he was greedy, and he was eventually charged with complicity in Darnley's murder, and he was executed on June 2nd, 1581. And he was executed by the maiden, which was an early form of the guillotine. But before that, James was declared an adult ruler in a ceremony known as Entry to Edinburgh on October 19th, 1579. So Morton was obviously no longer the regent. Now back to Esmé. James loved Esmé. Now, when I say that James loved Esmé, what I mean is that Esmé may have been James's first known male lover. There was for sure some infatuation by James, even though Esmé was about 24 years older than James, and Esmé was married with children. And let me remind you, James was only 15 years old when he was declared an adult ruler. Some think that James's affection for Esmé was not sexual, but rather he was seeking a father figure. But you know what? Sometimes it can be both. But what is clear is James really did like Esmé. A lot. James was not afraid to show Esmé his affection either. In 1580, James made Esmé's uncle Robert Stewart resign his earldom of Lennox and lordship of Darnley. On March 5th, 1580, Esmé was made the Earl of Lennox and Lord Darnley. He was also appointed to the Privy Council of Scotland, but James didn't stop there. James gave Esmé some of the jewels that belonged to Mary Queen of Scots in June of 1581. It was either a gold belt or chain of knots of pearls and diamonds. Then, in October of 1581, he gave him more jewels from Mary's collection. He gave him a gold cross with diamonds and rubies, the Great Harry or Great H of Scotland, that was a large diamond, ruby, and gold chain, a choker necklace with roses of gold and a pair of matching hair garnishings, another choker necklace and hair garnishings, and some other pieces. On August 8th, 1581, James made him Lorne O'Bingy, Dalkeith, Torboltoon, and Aberdour, Earl of Darnley and Duke of Lennox. He was the only duke in Scotland at the time. A lot of people didn't like the fact that Esmé was Catholic, so he converted to Protestantism. Many noticed that James also displayed physical affection towards Esmé. Some described it as Esmé drawing the king to carnal lust. It was reported that in the open, in front of people, James would wrap his arms around Esmé's neck and he would kiss him. James wrote a poem about Esmé after Esmé's death called "A Tragedy of the Phoenix," and it compared Esmé to an exotic bird of unique beauty that was killed by envy. James kept Esmé's family in high regard for the rest of his life, and he told his son, King Charles I, to do the same, and Charles did. So a lot of the earls did not like Esmé. He was French and he was Catholic, so they came up with a plan that is known as the Riven Raid. This took place on either August 22nd or August 23rd, 1582. Several nobles were involved, but it was led by William Riven, 1st Earl of Gorey. These lords were called the Lords Enterprisers, and their goal was to get rid of two of the king's favorites, James Stewart, Earl of Arran, and Esmé. King James VI, at this time, he was only King James VI. King James VI was kidnapped while he was hunting near the castle of Riven. The ones that kidnapped James were known as the Riven Raiders, and they were William Riven, John Erskine, 2nd Earl of Mar. This John Erskine was the son of the John Erskine that cared for James whenever he was a child. Thomas Lyon, Master of Lawns, the Lair of Easter Wims or Weems, I have seen it pronounced both ways, Lewis Belden, Robert Boyd, 5th Lord Boyd, Patrick Lindsay, 6th Lord Lindsay, Robert Pitcairn, David Erskine, commander of Dryburgh, the abbot of Paisley, the prior of Pittingween, and James Scrimgeour, the constable of Dundee. It was reported that James cried, which, if he did, I feel like crying is an appropriate response to being kidnapped. John Erskine, number 2, blocked Esmé's attempt of rescuing James with John's army. The Earl of Arran's brother William Stewart came to rescue James, and when he did, the raiders fought him, and William lost 2 fingers and he was captured. Arran then came and he was also captured. Esmé was forced into exile in France, and Esmé ended up dying in Paris in May of 1583. This regime was an ultra-Protestant regime. One of their goals was to get control of the court spending. James was known to be a big spender. He was also known to be a big drinker and have a big ego. One contemporary of his said that he had an ego the size of a whale. But back to James's spending. William Riven was the treasurer of Scotland, and he was owed £48,000 Scots. That debt was never paid. As time went on, more people joined the Riven regime. By the end of August, Francis Stewart, Earl of Bothwell, James Cunningham, 7th Earl of Glencairn, and Lawrence and Master of Oliphant had joined. A History Shelf alumni was very pleased with these events. Queen Elizabeth I actually sent them £1,000 in September of 1582. Now, not every earl was on board with kidnapping the king, holding him against his will, and taking over his government. The Earls of Huntly, Argyll, Athol, Crawford, Montrose, Sutherland, and of course the Earl of Arran and the Earl of Lennox did not support the Riven Raiders. In October of 1582, James was being kept at Holyrood House in Edinburgh, and the men that supported James urged people in Edinburgh to arm themselves and to go get James on their behalf. No one did that. Word was sent to Mary, Queen of Scots, about James being held captive. Mary had sent Jean Champion, a brother-in-law, to her secretary to Henry I, Duke of Guise, to talk about how to get James out. Catherine de' Medici, who was once the mother-in-law to Mary, Queen of Scots, when Mary was married to her first husband, the King of France, King Francis II, she even expressed concerns about James and Esmé. James was moved around a lot, but after the Riven Lords being in charge for 10 months, James was able to escape on June 27, 1583. William Riven was pardoned, but he kept plotting against James, and so he was eventually charged with high treason, and he was beheaded in May of 1584. The Earl of Arran ended up falling out of favor in November of 1585. James was a believer that the king should have total control over everything. In 1584, he made Parliament pass what is known as the Black Acts. What that did is it brought the Kirk, remember that is the Scottish Church, it brought the Kirk under royal control of 2 bishops. Now, not everyone was happy about that. Calvinists did not like this. James had to agree to let the General Assembly run the church. Though in 1603 he did stop the General Assembly from meeting and he increased the number of bishops. James wasn't just a king, though. He was also an author. He wrote a book of poetry called His Majesty's Poetical Exercises at Vacant Hours. He wrote a pamphlet about how he hated smoking called A Counterblast to Tobacco. He wrote political philosophy. He wrote The True Law of Free Monarchs and Basilican Doran. The True Law of Free Monarchs explained his belief in the divine right of kings, and Basilican Doran was a kingship manual for his heir. Between 1584 and 1603, James ran an effective government in Scotland. There are some parallels between James and the first person that I covered this season, King Edward II, but being an incompetent ruler was not one of them. One thing that he did have in common with Edward, though, was his debt problem. In 1596, an 8-man commission known as the Octavians were formed to take control over James's finances. They reduced the costs of the royal households, the number of courtiers that received meals at court, and as many as 70 posts were trimmed. They also imposed a 5% import tax. The Octavians were David Carnegie of Callaluthie, James Elphinstone, 1st Earl of Balmerinock, Thomas Hamilton, 1st Earl of Haddington, John Lindsay of Bellecaresse, Alexander Seton, 1st Earl of Dunfermline, Sir John Skene, Walter Stewart, 1st Lord Blantyre, and Peter Young of Stettin. The Octavians were not popular. In fact, they were hated. Some people feared that they would be sympathetic to Catholicism. Presbyterians attempted a coup on December 17, 1596, but this coup was really not a big deal. Some rioters called for arms after a sermon, but James was safely taken back to Holyrood House. After the riot, though, the Octavians were disbanded. On July 6, 1586, James signed the Treaty of Berwick. This was a treaty of peace between Scotland and England that both James and Queen Elizabeth I signed. Like I said in one of the King Edward II episodes, I believe it was the first one, Scotland and England have had a long history of being at war with each other. English monarchs have wanted the Scottish throne and vice versa. So this treaty called for peace between the two governments. It appears that James and Elizabeth didn't just sign this treaty so that their two countries would be at peace, though. It appears they each had an ulterior motive. For Elizabeth, she wanted the fact that she had plans to execute James's mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, to go down a little easier. Now, Mary had been imprisoned in England since 1568. That is 18 years. In those 18 years, there were a lot of plots to get Mary out. Some involved killing Elizabeth and having Mary take the English throne. Some of these plots Mary had no hand in, and some she may have. I'm not going to get too in detail about the many plots because I already did that on the episode that I did on Queen Elizabeth I. So if you haven't listened to that yet and you want more details about Mary, then give it a listen. It is season 1, episode 15. For James, his ulterior motive was he wanted the English throne. Elizabeth was not married. She never did get married and have an heir. So James was hoping to be that heir. He did have a claim to the English throne since he was a descendant of King Henry VII. Part of the treaty gave James an annual pension of £4,000 from England, and that led many to believe that basically Elizabeth had already decided that James was going to be her heir. On February 8th, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded. So, what was James's response to Elizabeth beheading his mama? And by the way, it was not an easy execution. It was messy and, I imagine, very painful. So, what was his reaction? Well, when she was sentenced to death, James did protest through an official petition, and when he found out that she had been beheaded, he said that it was a, quote, preposterous and strange procedure, end quote. That was it. He couldn't really do anything too dramatic because he did not want to make an enemy out of Elizabeth because he wanted to be her heir. And you got to remember, well, yes, Mary was James's biological mother. He didn't know her. He had no memories of her. He was taken from her when he was a baby and they didn't have contact with each other. So there was not an emotional attachment to her. James went on to support Elizabeth in 1588 when Elizabeth was at war with Spain. He gave her support as, quote, your natural son and compatriot of your country, end quote. And that is where I'm going to stop this episode. Like I said in the intro, this story is going to take multiple episodes for me to tell you it. So I'm going to stop part 1 here. Thank you so much for listening to the 5th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf. I am going to be covering 15 people this season. Next week's episode is going to be part 2 of King James VI and First's story. I'm going to start that episode with telling you about James's wife, Anne of Denmark. So I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Twitter is at History Shelf Pod. The Instagram is at History_Shelf_pod. And the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will send out a shout out to you on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of that episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month, and with that, you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month, and with that, you get the first 2 tiers, plus you will get a handwritten note of thanks mail to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month, and with that, you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want, except for the zip-up hoodie. You can also take out ad space on this podcast. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. Also, if you click on one of the affiliated links, that will help support the podcast. There's one for Riverside, and there's one for Amazon, and there's one for Bookshop. But if you don't want any of the merch or any of the perks, and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support the podcast, I have turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. Well, alright. Until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.